So I'm going to read from a couple of the prologues out of the over 50 that there are. And he addresses the reader directly, he addresses himself, he addresses his critics, and a lot of times he's reflecting over how the book is going to be received by various people. So these passages kind of focus on that. The first prologue is called Perspective. There's nothing worse than sloppiness, unless it's the facile perfection of solemnity. The book will be eminently sloppy, which is to say, it will commit the maximum discourtesy possible to its readers, except an even greater and all too common discourtesy, the perfect empty book. I've done what I can to hide the seams in the patchwork passages of my novelistic prose, which brings with it inexhaustible swatches of revision, and I do myself the service of confessing that no one will notice, because if ever a book demanded hard work, it's this one, and I believe that all art is labor, and very arduous labor at that. But I know that a very highly personal, contemplatory immortality awaits me. Generations of readers will pass the shop window, and nobody will stop to buy the book. This will be the novel that's thrown violently to the floor most often, and avidly taken up again just as often. What other author can boast of that? A novel whose incoherencies of plot are patched together with transversal cuts that show what the characters of the novel are doing in every moment. An irritating read, this book will annoy the reader like no other, with its false promises and inconclusive and incompatible mythology. Nevertheless, it's a novel that will not cause reader evasion, since it will produce an interest in the soul of the reader that will leave him allied to its destiny. It's a novel that needs lots of friends. And then this is prologue to my authorial persona. The greatest risk one runs in publishing a novel at this stage in life is that nobody knows your age. Mine is 73, and I hope that it will rescue me from a potential judgment such as, for the first good novel, it isn't bad at all. And since it's the author's first novel, we predict a brilliant future. And if he perseveres in his aesthetic conjurings with a strong will and discipline, we predict a brilliant future. In any case, we'll await his future work before rendering a definitive judgment. With this kind of postponement, I'll be left out of posterity, and prematurely at that. It's not flattery at every age when the critics postpone the judgment reserved for novices and squander all confidence on our future. Moreover, I had planned to publish this novel 22 years after the Earth completely exhausts its supply of petroleum, because a fortune teller once told me that at the same moment the world will run out of the ample supply of readerly yawns on which we presently rely. Unfortunately, the World Readers Union has promised to take revenge on a certain writer, reserving for him, he just announced his forthcoming work, all the abundant yawns at its disposal, and thus severely limiting the available supply for my no less anticipated novel. So you see what good luck it is to be a writer. With this guarantee, which nobody until now has enjoyed, who wouldn't happily hurl himself into the public eye? Also, I've noticed, since becoming an author, how grateful I am to the man who says, I've read everything. I'm counting on him to come through at an opportune moment, as this melancholy item just appeared in La Razón, on the impossibility of reading everything. I'm hurrying to publish my novel so that it may appear before the commencement of this exasperating impossibility.
So, the last reader that we're going to have is Dean Susan Gibbons, who's going to read from an anthology we published called The Wall in My Head. I'm going to preface this for a second. One of the things, I quote this article a lot in a lot of things I've written, but back in 2003, the New York Times ran an article called America Yawns at Foreign Fiction. And it was like this really downtrodden article about how nobody publishes books in translation, and even when they do, nobody reads them, and it was very like hard to take. And part of it is accurate. There's less than 3% of all the books published in America are in translation. And when you break that down and look at fiction and poetry, it's minuscule, it's tiny. There's less than 350 works of poetry and fiction published every year in translation. But since that date, since like 2003 when this article came out, there's been a number of things that have happened. Things like the University of Rochester's program, Open Letter, and Words Without Borders, which is an online website that publishes fiction from all over the world, and poetry and graphic novels and whatever else, and they support the idea of reading internationally. And so when Open Letter came into existence, they wanted to do this special anthology to honor the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and they wanted to partner with us because they thought it was a good match between what we were doing and our kind of ambitions and what they did as an organization. So together we created this anthology, which I hope is the first of many. I also think that it's kind of a symbol of the fact that there are more organizations that are getting involved in this kind of this arena, and that things are shifting. And the New York Times won't run an article like that now. In fact, they run kind of the opposite article, like when they did the article about us in December and about Open Letter in the university and celebrating the fact that we were doing literature and translation. So it seems like over these past 7 years, things have shifted dramatically, which is why this is a perfect place to sort of end in our event. So Susan, you could read.
This is Paris Lost by Vladimir Kaminer. Am I pronouncing that right? Yes.
Yeah, I think that's right.
You think that's right? Okay. Well, we'll do it. And let me just point out that this is a Russian trying to speak French at certain points, and so the butchery of the French language is quite deliberate. It has nothing to do with my talents here. One evening, my Uncle Boris told me about his trip to Paris. This was when his wife was still living. He was working in his business, and despite his rehabilitation and 12 years hard labor, he didn't dare dream of such a trip. But at the beginning of the 70s, it suddenly became a reality. Back then, every child knew that our socialist fatherland was beloved by all the peoples of the world, and only imperialist governments were against us. They spread lies about our daily life behind the Iron Curtain and tried to make us look like warmongers. But we were for freedom and understanding among peoples. Besides, our government was very generous to its citizens. It couldn't be compared to an imperialist regime. And so each year, 100 of our best proletarians were singled out. Laborers, construction workers, army officers, miners, or mothers with numerous offspring. They were all given a nearly free trip to Paris, sometimes even a trip to London. Naturally, on the condition that all the candidates were members of the party. The chosen had to agree to undergo a few routine health checks and receive instructions from the security organs on how to conduct themselves abroad. They had to sign documents stating that they would keep to themselves everything they saw in Paris or London, and then they could exchange 200 rubles into foreign currency and prepare for their departure. There was only one catch. Naturally, the government could not actually send its people to France, or even worse, England. The Soviet workers would be unable to resist the temptations of the capitalist world. Besides, the evil imperialists were lying in wait just for Soviet citizens to show themselves abroad, and had different traps and provocations prepared for them in order to be able to spread even more lies about the country. And so, such trips could exact a huge financial cost on the state treasury. Thus, the government hit on a comparatively economical, if less exciting, solution. It was to build its own abroad in the steppes of southern Russia, near Stavropol, with a real city and many inhabitants. It served in the summer as Paris, and later in the fall, when it began to rain and the clouds appeared, after a quick overhaul, it became London. The project had top secret status. Only employees of the state security agency lived and worked there with their families. They were specially trained. In the summer, they were required to speak only French among themselves, and in the fall, only English. The season began in June. The tourists would be picked up from Orly or Heathrow Airport by bus and driven to hotels. In small groups led by 2 travel guides, they would explore the clean-swept streets of the foreign country, buy pretty sweaters and unknown types of cheese,